Every single day, people in a bustling neighborhood noticed a peculiar scene. A group of stray dogs would gather around a homeless man. Passers-by couldn't help but wonder why these dogs were so drawn to him, and one day, a young woman decided to ask him directly. His answer would leave not just her, but the world, stunned. The man's name was Daniel, and though he was only in his late 30s, life had thrown him more challenges than most could imagine. Once upon a time, Daniel had been a diligent worker, pouring his heart and soul into everything he did. He may not have had a college degree, but he wasn't the type to let that hold him back. Determined to carve out a future for himself, he launched a small business. For a while, it flourished. But, as fate would have it, disaster struck, and the business crumbled beyond repair. No matter how hard Daniel tried to revive it, things only got worse. Soon, he found himself out of options, and his life took a dark turn. As the months passed, Daniel ended up on the streets. Yet, despite his circumstances, there was something different about him. Unlike most beggars who had understandably grown bitter or withdrawn, Daniel remained hopeful. Every morning, he greeted strangers with a smile, waved at children as they passed, and always made sure to thank anyone who gave him money. He never seemed to forget a face, and more than once, he'd call out a warm, "Thanks again," to someone who had helped him the day before. It was this warmth, this spark of gratitude that made Daniel stand out from the other homeless people who lined the streets. People couldn't help but notice that he seemed more joyful than anyone in his situation had any right to be. But it wasn't just Daniel's attitude that set him apart. What truly caught people's attention was his constant companionship with stray dogs. It started with just one, a scruffy, thin mutt that Daniel affectionately named Buddy. The two had met on Daniel's first day of begging when he noticed the dog scrounging for food scraps. Out of compassion for the creature's hunger, Daniel offered part of his meager lunch. At first, Buddy was wary, but with each passing day, trust grew, and before long, the two were inseparable. Daniel didn't just feed Buddy, he treated him like a friend, like family. He would wrap the dog in an old, tattered blanket on colder nights, holding him close as though he were cradling a child. Neighbors began to recognize Daniel not just by his friendly demeanor, but by the sight of him with Buddy nestled in his arms. Before long, more stray dogs started showing up, drawn to Daniel's kindness. Every week, it seemed, a new dog would appear, searching for a meal or perhaps just some warmth. Daniel couldn't turn them away. With every dollar he made from begging, he'd set aside a little to buy food for his furry companions. At first, it was just Buddy and 2 or 3 others. But as the months passed, more and more dogs started flocking to him. By the end of the year, Daniel had more than a dozen strays who seemed to view him as their protector. Despite his own hardship, Daniel found joy in their company. He didn't care if he had to split his food into smaller portions to feed them all. It didn't matter if he had little for himself. What mattered was that he could provide for those who had no one else. As the number of dogs grew, so did the curiosity of those passing by. People began to whisper and wonder, what was it about this man that drew so many stray animals to him? Why did these dogs, who had no reason to trust humans, gather around Daniel like he was one of their own? One day, as Daniel sat on the pavement, surrounded by his loyal pack, a young woman in her 20s approached him. Her curiosity had gotten the better of her. She had seen Daniel day after day with his growing family of dogs, and now she wanted answers. Expecting her to offer some money, Daniel was caught off guard when she instead asked him about the dogs. He smiled warmly and told her his story, how he had always loved animals, even from a young age, and how, despite the curveballs life had thrown him, that love had never faded. He explained that before ending up on the streets, he had run a small animal shelter. It had been his life's passion. But when funding dried up and donations weren't enough to keep it afloat, Daniel was forced to close the shelter. Many of the animals found new homes, but others weren't so lucky. The guilt of losing the shelter and having to euthanize animals he cared for weighed heavily on him, sending him into a deep depression. It was in this state of despair that Daniel had turned to alcohol, trying to numb the pain of feeling like he had failed the very creatures he had sworn to protect. Eventually, his life spiraled out of control, and he wound up homeless. But even then, When he had nothing, his instinct to care for animals remained. He couldn't save them all, but for the ones that crossed his path, he would do everything he could. The young woman was moved by Daniel's story and asked if she could share it online. It turned out she was a social media influencer, and when Daniel agreed, she posted his story along with photos of him and his dogs. What happened next was beyond anything Daniel could have imagined. Within days, his story went viral, reaching people all over the world. Donations began pouring in, not just money, but offers of help and support from animal lovers everywhere. With the overwhelming support he received, Daniel was finally able to get off the streets. He rented a small house with enough space to care for even more dogs. Today, Daniel's life looks very different from the one he had known just a year earlier. His home, his garden, even his old beat-up car, everything is now filled with animals he rescues and nurtures back to health. Daniel's story is a testament to the unbreakable bond between humans and animals, and proof that no matter how dire life circumstances, compassion can always find a way to shine through. His journey reminds us that we are more than the hardships we face. We are defined by the kindness we show to others, even when we have little ourselves.